It's my pleasure to introduce Barry Smith, who will be presenting the talk Functions, Dispositions, and Capabilities.
Thank you, Brian. Some of you will be aware of this paper which came out in 2016, in which we tried to define the notion of function and various related notions in a more precise way than we had in earlier BFO documents. The charge when we were writing the paper, which appeared in an issue of Applied Ontology devoted to the topic of functions, was to address the desiderata of a theory of function which had been outlined by Artiga in an earlier paper. He distinguished four desiderata, some of which we believe are quite acceptable, particularly the first three here. I'm going to talk a lot later on about the normativity criterion, so I won't discuss that now. Another important feature of what I'm going to be saying is what he calls the accident criterion, which says that an entity's function is appropriately distinguished from side effects. Side effects are one step in the direction of what I'm going to be calling a capability, which is the primary focus. The one criterion which I don't like is epiphenomenalism, not only because it has a misleading name, but also because it seems to me to be quite wrong about so many interesting functions. Consider, for instance, sperm frozen in a sperm bank. We would not determine, in any sense, determine the function of those sperm by looking at their current performance. I believe that in this particular criterion, Artiga is confusing the ontology of function with the epistemology of function. He thinks that we can only know what the function of an entity is if we look at what it's doing now. And I think that's wrong. I think it's understandable why he might think that there is a good criterion here, but I think he's formulated it in a wrong way. The 2016 version of our definition of function rests upon the idea of a realizable specifically dependent continuant, of which there are two large varieties, maybe others, but we only define two, which we call roles and dispositions. And I think this is familiar to everybody. A role is a specifically dependent continuant that arises because something happens outside the bearer. So it doesn't change the makeup of the bearer. So when you get a new job, somebody signs a piece of paper, you become an employee, and you don't change physically. And then we have dispositions, which exist because of the way you are physically. So if you want to acquire a disposition, you have to change physically in a corresponding way. Or you may already have the disposition from the beginning of your existence. For instance, male humans have a disposition to go bald. All humans have a disposition to breathe. Now, roles and dispositions are not completely separate from each other. So once you acquire a certain role, it's very common that you thereby also begin to acquire certain dispositions. So the job that you are appointed to, once you begin performing in that role, you will thereby also acquire certain habits, skills, so forth, certain capabilities, as we will say, in virtue of the fact that you are working in this particular position. And then function, the new definition, which is really just an attempt to clarify the old definition, so I don't think it's essentially new, is to see a function as a disposition, and so it's something which exists in virtue of the way the bearer is physically. And this physical makeup arises in a specific way, either through natural selection or through intentional design. So the idea is that the bearer has a physical feature, and that physical feature is of a sort that bearers like this one who have it exist because of some specific kind of etiology, namely either natural selection or intentional design. And it's very difficult, of course, to express that clearly, But I don't think that there is any other coherent account of what distinguishes functions from things like side effects, capabilities, for instance, and dispositions of other sorts. Now, some people have a different view, and these people have PowerPoint slides with a yellow background, such as one here. That Phillip, who is the author of a paper on functions in 2009, presented a critique of the earliest statements of the BFO theory of function. I believe a very valuable critique, which I hope to address in more detail in due course. I'm going to respond to it rather quickly here so that we can get on to the capabilities. In the earlier view, in about 2008, we tied biological function to the idea that the relevant physical structure is a result of the expression of the organism's structural genes. This is a view which derives from Cornelius Ross's account of anatomical structure. Has a function of walking because it is the result of the coordinated expression of certain genes which arose through evolution because precursor organisms gradually started to move around in different ways, and those organisms which moved around slightly better than other organisms because they had precursor feet, had more offspring, and so their precursor feet gradually spread through the population, and then of that population, the ones which had even more effective precursor feet had more offspring, and so on, until eventually they had real feet, something like that. Now, Phil has various counterexamples to the original formulation. I'm not sure that the tumor is a result of the coordinated expression of the organism's structural genes in the way that Cornelius Ross described that. So I'm not worried by tumors. I am worried by the blood vessels which develop in tumors because they seem to have the function of keeping the tumor alive, as it were. A male ant. Here I think he does have a point. I am now very seriously thinking that organizations can have function, and specifically ant colonies can have organizational parts which have function. And I think that this might be a partial solution to the problem of the function of the male ant relative to the ant colony. And now with the protein, Phil here has struck home with regard to the original definition, but I think that the definition which I stated earlier, which does not mention coordinated expression of structural genes, can do justice to those proteins which have function. So I think we're on better ground in regard to the last counterexample. Functions are a disposition with a certain kind of etiology. Phil's new definition, I believe, is somewhat similar, but he makes two mistakes. The first mistake is that the definition is circular. So you can't define a term by using that term in the definition. Now, the second mistake has to do with homology. Phil thinks that you can have biological functions only if you have homologous structures. Now, I actually think this is a good idea, and I wish I'd thought of it earlier. I think that this kind of account is correct. In other words, wherever we have a biological function, we are likely to have homologous structures. The problem with this as a definition, however, is that it can't account for the very first organisms which had a specific biological function. It can only account for biological functions which are spread to different species, and this, it seems to me, is a flaw. A final point from the yellow background PowerPoint camp is that BFO-2, because it's still using evolution, the evolutionary etiology as the basis of its counter function, cannot solve the problem because it's hard to measure evolution. I agree. I don't think this is a good objection, however, because it's hard to measure whether something has a function or not. And if it was easy to measure what a function was on the basis of a given definition, this would be a problem for that definition. To see why it's difficult, first of all, functions are rows. many, many generations ago in the biological chain of things. We can't examine what went on in those many generations ago, although we're getting closer to being able to do that with genomic research. But we can also have cases where functions arise in our own time. Let's imagine, for instance, that we have a system in the body like the glycogen system, and some mutation creates an alternative way of regulating blood glucose. Some organisms in a certain population have two ways simultaneously of synthesizing glycogen. Which of these symptoms has the function is a question which does not have a clear answer. In the course of time, we can suppose that the new system will take over, and then we will be able to say unambiguously that this new system has this function. But we will never know when the switch occurs. And I think this is a general problem about functions. In the case of designed functions of artifacts, we know when the function begins to exist. In the case of evolved functions of biological entities, we typically do not know. Now let's move to dispositions, because we want to look at another child of disposition in addition to functions. So functions, as we've already seen, are dispositions that entities have because they were designed or selected to have those dispositions. Kinds of things which have functions are parts of organisms. I still am tempted to believe that organisms never have functions, although I agree with Phil that artificially created bacteria, which have been created to perform the function of eating oil spills, for instance, seem to be good candidates of organisms that can have functions. In the BFO community, we are addressing the idea currently of whether software and other information entities, generically dependent continuums, can have functions, but I'll leave that aside. The big question is, can people have functions? Putting aside slavery, I think that people cannot have functions, but I think that people can have capabilities. The following, it seems to me, are attractive candidates for bearers of capabilities. So organisms, parts of organisms, everything which can have a function can have a capability, because every function, I believe, is a capability. Ant colonies certainly can have capabilities. Factories can have capabilities, and so forth. Hospitals can have capabilities, as we shall see. So what I'm going to talk about now is how do we define capability? A capability has to be a special kind of disposition. And a function has to be a special kind of capability, I believe. But how do we define what this special kind is? First of all, there are no capabilities on Mars. Dead matter, other things being equal, does not have capability. So if we say this shoreline has the capability to withstand the storm surge of a Category 5 hurricane, and this is because we have turned the shoreline into real estate. It's not dead matter. It's part of the social world. And I believe that that's the only way in which it makes sense to talk about capabilities of dead matter. So when we start to have Mars tourism, we will begin to talk about the capabilities of Martian valleys or whatever they have on Mars. But currently, there are no capabilities on Mars. This is where we go back to Artiga's normativity. What normativity means is that if an entity has a function, then we can evaluate it on a scale. Now, it's very important that we think carefully about this criterion. It's not part of the definition of function, but still I believe it holds of all functions, that wherever an entity has a function, we can grade it from better or worse. And if anyone has counterexamples, I will be very grateful. All right, so normativity. This is a heart, for instance, very healthy heart, functioning very well. The bearer of the heart gets older, and gradually the heart begins to not function or malfunction, and then you die. So this is the hypothesis. Every function can be graded on a scale. Now I'm going to use this to define capability. Capabilities are dispositions which can be graded on a scale. Every function is a capability if there are no counterexamples to the thesis that every function can be graded on a scale. And so, From this, it follows that every function is a capability. Every capability is a disposition by definition, because capability is a disposition which can be graded on a scale. Now, all of the difficult parts of this story, of course, rest upon what we mean by graded on a scale. And here is the summary. Now, let's talk about human capabilities, first of all, because they're the ones for which we have the clearest intuitions. I think that here, graded on a scale, we can cash out in terms of the disposition being such that its realization is good for the human being in question, conceivably also for the community, the family to which the person in question belongs, or to the company to which the person in question belongs. So I think we understand what good for means here. These are some examples, and this is the first example which shows that grading on a scale may be actually multi-dimensional. So we can grade writing, the capability to write, according to how well you write. And that too can be multidimensional. So you may write with a very elaborate and beautiful calligraphy, or you may write effectively, or you may write in a rhetorically impressive way, or you may write in a very humorous way. And all of those things are gradable on a scale. But you can also grade how you exercise the capability. So you may write about the right amount. You may write too much. You may write obsessively about a single topic which begins with letter O. Or you may err in the opposite direction. You may write too little, or you may write not at all. And this is disastrous for somebody who lives in a culture where they have to write in order to exist. And you can think about the same sorts of grading on a scale, multidimensionality issues for other kinds of capabilities. So penguins are supposed to have the capability for singing. And if they can't sing, then they don't find a mate. And so on with other capabilities. And in all of these cases, you can have too much of the exercise of the capability. And again, we have a hypothesis that for human capability, grading along this axis of having too much of it or having too little of it is common to all human capability. And again, I would appreciate counterexamples for this particular hypothesis. All right. Now, I'm going to summarize from the green PowerPoint background camp an application of this idea of what ability is from a PhD student of ours in Buffalo who is now working in Texas, which he used as a basis for a theory of patient welfare. So these slides are taken from Peter Koch with some modest changes of wording, but the ideas are his. So patient welfare is taken to be a central notion of medical ethics. We don't just want to keep the patient alive in all circumstances. We are not exclusively concerned with the patient's health in all circumstances. We are concerned with the patient's welfare. Now, so how do we define welfare? Well, some people say it's defined as meaning well-being, but that is, of course, circular. Other people identify welfare with health, but one can see ways in which somebody can be healthy and yet have a very low level of welfare. So welfare is something other than just health. Some people define welfare in terms of interests, but then not all interests are directed towards welfare. So you may have a cognitive interest in some topic which you obsess about to a degree which is clearly inimical to your welfare. And then happiness is not welfare because we can arrive at happiness in ways which clearly are also not conducive to our having a high level of welfare. So Peter Koch develops the theory of welfare as an occurrence, or as based upon an occurrence called faring well. So you have welfare if you are faring well. And he applies this to welfare of any subject. And you can be faring well along many dimensions. So you can be faring well along the dimension of health, you can be faring well along the dimension of happiness, and so forth. And then he ties the notion of faring well to the notion of having capabilities. You fare well, not just because you have certain capabilities, but because you realize those capabilities. So if you are extremely cognitively capable, but you are trapped in a prison where you're not allowed to communicate or read or write, then you are not faring well because of those capabilities. And so his definition of welfare is that it's the degree to which an entity exercises the array of capabilities that, when realized, are good for that entity. And again, he, I'm sure, would welcome counterexamples definition. So welfare comes in degrees. It's going to be a multidimensional phenomenon because of the multidimensional array of capabilities a typical entity has. And good for is going to be dependent upon the nature of the entity. And here we're interested in patients, which has the welfare, whose faring well is to be evaluated. So there will be different reference classes. What is good for a newborn baby, or what is good for a mature adult, or what is good for a biomedical informatician, are all going to be different reference classes determined by different normal cases. The normal cases will determine where someone stands on the scale of good for. So here are some examples of capabilities. Capability to be educated, to have friends, to get food, and so on. To exercise. Now, capabilities and functions are connected in ways. So you have a hand. Your hand has the function to grasp, and for this reason, you have the capability to grasp. So the function of the part becomes the capability of the whole. I think that this is, we haven't pursued this in great detail yet, but I think that this is a very interesting step towards understanding side effects, machines, for instance. The car has the the car has the function to transport people and things from one place to another. The steering wheel has the function to turn the car in one direction or another. The car doesn't have the function of turning, but it has the capability of turning because the steering wheel has the function of turning. And we could say something similar about janitors in hospitals. So the janitor has the role, at least, of cleaning the corridors. The hospital has the function of curing the sick, and there's some relation there between the function of curing the sick and the capability of the sick to walk down corridors with doctors. All right, so capabilities are somehow good. This is a problem, of course, because we have no way of defining the term good in anything like a BFO-based formal ontology. But still, it seems to be true that capabilities are somehow good. So, as Peter Koch writes, not every capable of expression translates into a capability. Because someone is capable of suicide does not mean that they have a special capability, just as the fact that an oncogene is capable of giving rise to cancer does not mean that it's a function of the relevant gene to give rise to cancer. So, as we said, welfare is the array of capabilities which are good for the bearer. Now, from the perspective of patient welfare, the good of the community is probably of not any great relevance. But if we were exploring employee welfare in a company, then it could very well be that the good of the company could be of equal or perhaps higher importance than the good of the bearer of the capability. So we want employees in a company to have capabilities which are good for that company. All right, so as we already saw, that when we start to examine patient welfare, we need to distinguish a set of reference classes, and then we can establish the scale from good to less good in relation to the normal or canonical or typical instances within those reference classes. Normal babies, premature versus premature babies, normal premature babies, and so forth. And then we can divide the reference classes more narrowly. For instance, we could have adult patients who experience chronic pain, and so forth. And for each of those reference classes, we're going to have different scales of patient welfare, goodness and badness. All right, and that's just summarizing what I just said. In order to promote patient welfare, and this is the part of the job of the medical professional, you have to work out which reference class the patient belongs to, identify the patient's capabilities, and promote the realization of those capabilities. So you act in such a way that you bring the patient as close as you can to the normal state of welfare along the relevant scale, or to be higher than the normal state of welfare. And this explains why the various common definitions of welfare at the beginning of the green slides, although this doesn't look very green. This should be green, essentially. It don't work because the promotion of welfare as here defined is by no means identical to things like promoting desire fulfillment or pleasure or those other things. All right, now that's the end of the green slides. Now, there is in fact a gigantic literature on classifying capability. If you're an engineering company and you need to decide who you should use as supplier for machine parts, for the machines that you're building, you need to know a great deal about the capabilities of other companies, other products on the market which might serve to be parts of your machine, other engineers, other factories, other transport systems which get the parts to your company, and so on and so on. And so there is already a body of work on the ontology of capabilities. And that one of the leading figures in this field, Farhad Ameri, you can see is the author of this particular work, is actually working with BFO in order to test the application of the account of capability I just described to solving problems of search and data integration in the field of capability for the manufacturing industry. There are also, so here is some of the work that he's been doing, which I'm formulating in my own terms. So engineered artifacts have capabilities because they too can be graded on a scale, but now the relevant beneficiary is not the artifact. It's not a person necessarily. It may be a person if it's the owner of the artifact, or it may be the user of the artifact, or it may be the users of an artifact which has that artifact as parts, and so on. Just to get back to side effects, it's clear that artifacts have functions. But what every engineer knows is that artifacts also have to have capabilities. So the artifact may have the function to drill holes in the ground, but it has to have the capability of drilling holes in sandy ground, in rocky ground, at very high temperatures, at a low level of noise, and so on. All of these are capabilities. And engineers are just as interested in capabilities as they are in function of the artifacts they've designed. But then also, as we saw, engineering companies have capabilities. And then also, hospitals have capabilities. And so that one of the applications of this work that I intend to pursue is to try to understand the capabilities of a hospital by analogy with the capabilities already discussed by Ameri and other people of engineering companies. Here, the beneficiaries, I'm saying, are the stakeholders in the organization. I haven't worked out the details of that yet. I would be interested here again in hearing counterexamples. But this is the final slide. Of course, the big problem with everything I've said is that it's not clear how on earth it might be added to BFO. The first reason is that BFO is not merely interested in all the things that are on Earth. It's interested in all the things that are in the universe. BFO is a formal ontology, and the idea of benefit or goodness or even grading seem to belong to the level of domain ontologies, which have a narrower focus. And I think the focus in the end is going to be human beings. I think that a world without human beings may be a world without capability. But I don't have any good solution to this problem yet. It's a difficult problem, and I would particularly appreciate help in addressing this problem. And that's the end. So thank you very much.
Right, questions? We do have Phillip Lord here.
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can, yeah.
Okay, so I wanted to make two small points about function. So you had a specific critique of my definition because we needed at least two things to have a function. Yeah, because you have this idea that you need homology, and you can only have homology when you've got more than one. So I talked about that in the paper quite extensively, and I'm still quite happy that with my definition not applying to the primordial soup. You know, everything else, every other organism that we see has either extant or extinct relatives. So I see that that's not a problem for anything other than the very original primordial soup. I think that actually fits because you talked about that, where you talked about emergent properties, functions that start to come when a mutation happens, and that happens to be advantageous. The other one I was saying, you talked about the function of an organism, and I was just amused because one of the first examples of the function you used was in fact the function of an organism, because you talked about the function of a sperm right at the very beginning, and a sperm is biologically a distinct organism from its from you or whatever generated it. It's an individual, it's a complete organism by every definition of the word organism. So actually that's an example. A sperm cannot have a function by your definitions.
To what species does this organism belong?
It belongs, it's a human sperm.
I don't know. You have to say it's a human being, so just say that for me.
Yeah, no, I didn't say that. I mean, a human being.
You wouldn't say. So to what species does the sperm belong?
It's human, yes.
You're not answering the question. When I cut off my fingernails, the shavings are human in the same sense, conceivably.
No, so they're part of human. The difference is many...
No, not when I cut them off.
Yeah, no, I'll explain. So many organisms, like yeast, for example, spend most of their life cycle as the gamete, as the sperm, and that is their entire life cycle. It's called the alternation of the generations. There are many plants that do this as well, and they have one existence in the sperm where they have stomachs and they're multi-organisms, and they exist in a haploid phase, and then they produce the diploid phase very transiently. So actually, both the sperm and an egg happen to be independent organisms of both of the thing that produce them. They are complete organisms. I can take you through the biology because it's probably a bit detailed here, but nonetheless, biologically, this is true.
So this is interesting. I'm quite familiar with the plant case because I've been working with the plant ontology community for quite some time. I have never ever heard anyone in the field of, I have to be very careful here, gynecology ontology or embryo ontology. So the field of study where people try to determine when human beings first begin to exist. Do they begin to exist at consumption, at the fusing of sperm and egg, or do they begin to exist at the completion of gastrulation, or do they begin to exist at birth, or do they begin to exist when they first start thinking, and so on? I have never heard anybody put forward the thesis that already the sperm is a human being.
It's an organism. A human being is a loaded term.
Yeah, so now there are, I know, it's the name of the species, Homo sapiens. So you agree, while your proposition is indeed interesting, and while it does indeed pose a challenge to my way of thinking, incidentally, blood cells, I guess, would pose a similar challenge.
No.
Why not? Well, they're human and they're cells, and some of them exist outside the organism.
They're not reproductively capable.
Well, neither is a sperm all by itself.
In humans, the sperm can only do one thing, which is it can become another. It can fuse with an egg, and then you get the diploid.
Good. All right. So, and that's the function of the sperm. So I think that I would be willing to compromise if the following thesis, that no organism of a species can have a function. However, there can be organisms which are not of a species, and here you need a verb like species-ish or something, human-ish, which do have functions. And the best example would be sperm. Sperm are organisms, sperms are human, but sperm are not human beings.
No, but then I was going to say, if you look at a yeast cell, which exists its entire life cycle, it's the gamete.
Yeah, so what? We wouldn't need this for yeast. I'm not sure that yeast cells have functions.
Right, anyway, I'll stop there because I'll be going on too long. But I'll send you a little description of the biology, because the biology is subtle and it's an odd way of looking at it for humans, but it's a very naturalistic way of looking at it for all.
Yeah, I like the idea, so I'm looking forward to hearing more.
I will be. Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions? Yes.
Hello, Barry. It's Adrien. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I had a question about this BFO distinction that you reminded between role as externally grounded and disposition as internally grounded. Because if you consider weight, for example, weight could be seen as a disposition to accelerate towards the Earth, thinking about weight on the Earth. And it's actually grounded in part in the mass of the object, which is theoretic, but also in the gravitational field, which is generated by the Earth. So wouldn't it be a counterexample to the thesis that dispositions are defined as internally grounded?
So when I'm careful, I usually avoid using weight and I use mass instead. And I think that some of the problems you're raising here are resolved when we talk about mass. However, I think that we do need a better account of what qualities are. And part of the problem here is that we need to distinguish the quality which an entity has from the quality which can be measured. So in order to measure mass, we would need to take into account all kinds of externally grounded features of measurement scales and so forth. But the mass that we measure is independent of those externally grounded features, but of course we can't know what those externally grounded features are without measurement. So we need to have a better account of what quality is.
Sure, that's all for mass, but I mean, you want also an account of weight. I don't know, if you do an ontology of classical physics or whatever, you want to have an account of weight on top of the account of mass. So what would be weight if not a disposition which is externally grounded?
So I can answer your question very easily just by saying, okay, weight is a disposition.
But then it's externally grounded, right?
It's externally grounded, yes, because in order to have weight, you have to have something like gravity.
Yeah, so it's grounded in the gravitational field. Okay, so that was, yeah.
That doesn't mean that I have made that concession. I just said that I could answer your question by waiting.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Do you have another? Yeah.
If nobody has question, I may have another one. So because you concluded in saying that so welfare would consist in promoting realization of capabilities, but not promotion of desire fulfillment or promotion of pleasure. But the realization of capabilities, so as you said, is evaluated on a scale of goodness. And you said that there was a question of, how you would measure goodness, which is still an open question, as I understood. So eventually, it might be the case that goodness would be defined in terms of desire fulfillment or pleasure. So still welfare would be defined ultimately in terms of these notions, right? I mean, you would, it could be defined, welfare could be defined in promoting realization of capabilities towards fulfilling desire or promoting pleasure. Would it be something possible according to you?
So I will give you a little bit more background to explain why the argument was formulated in the way it was, and then we can go back to your question. So Peter Koch was very interested in the idea that welfare could be applied not to human beings, but also to other organisms. So plants, for instance, have the capability to blossom or flower, and this capability can be realized well or not so well along various dimensions. And this capability is it's not it does not involve any kind of happiness on the part of plants. Plants don't have happiness, but still it seems to be a capability which we would be ready to recognize as such. And so the answer to your question, or the point of view deriving from your question, would be that the reason why we say that plants have the capability to blossom and why we regard this as being a capability is because blossoming plants make human beings happy. Now, I think that there is a grain of truth to what you're saying. I think that everything that I said about human capabilities and about real estate and about machine bringing benefit to users, for instance, will in the end bottom out in some kind of making happy or making satisfied of certain relevant populations or groups of human beings. Now, I haven't worked it all out, but I think that you may be right that there is a sort of ultimate happiness measure upon which the entire chain of capability, benefit, scales ultimately depends.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? No one else has one. I have one, actually. So you mentioned that organizations could have capabilities, and capabilities are dispositions, which would mean that capabilities are internally grounded or grounded in the physical makeup of the bearer of the disposition or capability. But I'm having a hard time seeing why an organization would have a capability in virtue of its physical makeup alone.
Good. So BFO, to the extent that it has an ontology of organizations, which is still far true only in the sense that we are thinking very hard about it, views organizations as aggregates of persons, not including sperm. And these persons have employee roles, and they have management roles, and they have director roles, and they have been performing in these roles for a greater or lesser period of time. And I said earlier in one of the slides that when you are performing in a role, you will very quickly acquire certain kinds of dispositions. Dispositions or skills or habits involved in instructing your subordinates or following the instructions of your superiors, programming your superior's computer, using your computer in ways which further the goals of the company and so forth. So that particular aggregate of persons is embodied through all of the dispositions on the parts of its members, with all kinds of dispositions of its own. The dispositions to respond quickly to customer complaints, the disposition to know very quickly which suppliers to use when you need certain sorts of machine parts, the disposition to make sure that the trains run on time if you're a transport company, and so on. So organizations have dispositions. That, I believe, is not a problem.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Going once, going twice. All right. Thank you again very much.
Oh, thank you all very much.